Family Matters. This is a cut chapter from the first No Flesh Shall Be Spared novel. I thought that there were a few loose ends in the story that needed some tidying up, so I wrote this. For flow reasons, I went with the more John Ford ending that's in the book, but I like this piece and wish I could have included it. I like that it sort of puts a button on Monk's story and hints at the life he might have had if he'd only just gotten out in time. There's just a simple beauty to this one that I find appealing. Hopefully you will too. Chill, November wind blew dried maple leaves across the wraparound porch of the old farmhouse that sat out at the end of Old Severin Road. The building's paint was cracked and its eaves sagged just a little, but the sense of warmth and welcome it gave off was undeniable. The brisk breeze blew across the back of Aileen Chaiken's neck as she sat in her favourite porch chair, and it caused her to shiver. She pulled her worn blue cardigan a little tighter around her thin shoulders and hugged herself, her black hair swirling about her head like a pinwheel in the breeze. She pinched her face and squinted to see across the wide meadow that separated her modest two-story farmhouse from the fields of corn and soybeans she and her husband Oren owned and worked. She got out of the chair slowly and walked over to the porch's railing, which ran alongside the perimeter of the house. As she leaned against one of the posts that supported the overhanging bedrooms on the second floor, she tried to see where Oren had gotten to. Her view was obscured, however, by the rows of crops. That man. He was always working too hard, she mused. Lord only knew from where he got his energy. He was always up before anyone on the farm, and the last to turn the lights out. Even at his age, the man never stopped. In the living room window, she caught a glimpse of herself, and realizing she was squinting again, instantly relaxed her features. The reflection she saw there reminded her of one of those little apple head dolls Susie Lynn Russet sold at the county fair every year, their crumpled brown faces gaping out foolishly from behind the meticulously stitched-together costumes of felt and gingham that she'd made for them. Aileen carefully stepped down from the porch and walked without hurry across the ankle-deep grass that made up the house's front yard. She turned at the flower bed of roses, thinking that if it didn't rain soon, she'd have to put some water on them. The blooms were looking sad and the leaves were wilting slightly. Once past the colourful flowers, she headed on across the meadow toward the main roadway. She'd initially come out of the house to fetch the day's mail from the box located out at the edge of the property, but had gotten distracted by the splendour of the day and the comfort of her overstuffed chair. Jessup Browning, who'd been their mailman for nearly a decade, always arrived with his deliveries right around noon each and every day. He was funny that way, punctual in the way only country folk could be, and he'd not been late or sick a day in all of the years they'd lived on the farm. It was unlikely he would be late today. She glanced down at the watch clinging to her wrist and saw that Mickey's hands were straight up in what her father had always called the hostage position. She chuckled briefly, but still felt the bite from the distant memory. As she walked along, she was finally able to see Oren, who was across the field, driving the tractor back toward the barn. She could see his dark hair shimmer like glass for a moment in the day's sun. It was easy for her to imagine the sweet smell of the day on him, on his clothes, in his hair, on his skin. As it was getting to be just about noon, he'd no doubt be more than ready for his lunch. She knew he'd be wanting something hot, something that would stick to his ribs after a hard morning of toiling in the oftentimes unresponsive fields. They were lucky, though, she supposed, luckier than most. A lot of their neighbours had already had to sell their lots out. Or at the very least, they were slowly being bled to death by the bank as they tried to stay in operation. Loans taken had a way of coming due at the worst possible times, and the hard life of carving your existence from the earth could sometimes be fickle. Being a farmer had never been an easy thing. It meant that your life was either feast or it was famine, although usually more famine than feast. Still, though, it was all Oren knew, all he'd ever known. Only the good Lord knew how many farms in other parts of the county were gone now, gobbled up by the big corporations after all that unpleasantness with the dead a number of years back. Even though folks around here had been fortunate in that regard, the population wasn't so dense in these parts. So when the dead ones came back, the population here had been pretty spread out. It had been easy to track them and put them all back down in short order. Whatever the local police or militia couldn't send back to their graves, the deceased's own family were pressed into service. Farming and tending livestock meant that you soon became comfortable with the idea of death and dying. Animals were born, they lived, and then they died to serve out their respective roles in the cycle. It was just the way things worked, so it was usually a quick prayer and a load of buckshot that returned things back to the way God had intended them. It was another one of the good things about most farmers being hunters. They had access to guns, and they knew how to use them. Far off, she heard a sudden yelp followed by a curse that only the devil could author come from the direction of the fields. It was a sound that she knew all too well. Oren had a way of getting himself hurt with the slightest of provocations. He was always stubbing his toe or jamming his finger on things. His mother used to say that he could cut himself in a room full of pillows. She was gone now, but the saying survived. Over the years they were together, she'd heard that yelp and the curses that always followed it, more times than she wished to remember. She made a mental note, though, to get the first aid kit out and have it ready for him with his lunch. The two of them had been married for going on 20 years now, and they'd been 20 good years at that. They'd met at a local market, each grabbing for the same ear of sweet corn. Their eyes met, and that, as they say, was that. A swift courtship ensued, and the two of them were married a short time after, just a few short months after she'd come to this place in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of Ohio. The children came along in their own time and were the apples of both their eyes. Oren's family had been farmers, as had their family before them. It was a vocation that had been handed down from father to son like an old, tattered coat, with each successive generation finding that the garment yielded less and less in the way of warmth. The farm had given them life, though, and it made for fertile ground for them to lay down roots. The farm was family. As for her side of the family tree, they were not people with whom she regularly kept in contact, especially her father. What she knew about him was limited to the sporadic things she'd read in the newspapers about the very different life her father had chosen for himself. Her mother died giving birth to her, so Aileen had never been able to know her. She'd only heard stories. Growing up as an only child, she'd been raised by her mother's elderly parents and had seen precious little of her father as she matured. He'd chosen a path that she could never understand, and, once she was married and had become a parent herself, one which she would not have anywhere near the children. She still held out hope that she and her father would one day reconcile, and had even extended an open invitation for him to come live with her, should he ever decide to leave his old life behind. Who knew? Life could be funny sometimes. She looked back over her shoulders and saw that Oren was out of the field and had just reached the large double doors of the barn. It would take him another half an hour or so to put up the tractor and give the livestock their afternoon feeding. There was still plenty of time for her to fetch the day's mail and return to the kitchen to warm up some soup for the two of them. She might even slice up one of the loaves of bread she'd pulled from the oven that morning, knowing they would still be warm for dinner. She sighed quietly to herself as she continued across the field. She was tired but still felt content in the knowledge that their lives were simple ones, and despite the hardships and the loans and the worry, they were glad for it. She'd never been one for the lights and bustle of city life, and the existence she and her family had carved out for themselves here was a comforting juxtaposition to the life her father led. Aileen approached the fence which ran along the property line and carefully stepped over one of the split railings. The soothing scent of wild petunias and yellow-fringed orchids rode on the breeze like aromatic hitchhikers and teased her sense of smell. Despite her caution, the hem of her dress got snagged on a sharp splinter of wood, and it ripped slightly. "Oh dear," she said aloud, her voice sounding like silk as it was caught on the midday's air. "Tsk, now I'll have to mend that." She looked up at the road and thought that it looked like a thin black ribbon that had been stretched out in either direction for as far as her eye could see. In other words, the way was as clear as it always was at this time of day. Neighbors were all undoubtedly still busy with their chores and had no time, much less an inclination to travel anywhere, not with the weather being as fickle as it had been as of late. Off in the distance, she saw the gathering plumes of dark clouds amassing in the distant sky. "Looks like we'll have a bit of rain coming tonight." With a small hop, she leapt across the drainage ditch which ran between the road and the property line. It was dry now, but it was choked with robust moth-mullein weeds, their white flowers brightly reflecting back the sunlight. Once she was across, she walked over to the mailbox. It was an old rusting thing that Oren had nailed to one of the fence posts that splintered a year or so ago. They'd found the length of wood back when they were replacing the fence in what Oren always referred to as the back 40, even though it was only a few anemic acres. They'd been meaning to replace the old thing with a new one from the Ace Hardware back in town, but what with the crops needing looking after and the daily care of the livestock, they simply hadn't gotten around to it as of yet. She pulled down the front door of the mailbox, opening it, and smiled when she saw that Jessup Browning had not disappointed her. It was nice to have some things that you could still count on, she thought to herself. Pulling the envelopes and advertisements from inside, she looked them over one at a time. Bills. Bills. A flyer from the feed supply depot in town. More bills. She moved to close the box, but noticed the corner of another, larger envelope laying deep inside, hidden in the shadows of the mailbox's dark interior. She bent down in order to get a better look at it. Sure enough, there toward the back lay a folded-over manila envelope wrapped in 2 large rubber bands. She idly noticed that there was no postmark on it. She mused as she glanced around. What on earth? Aileen reached inside and pulled the faded package out. It was heavy and felt like it had 4 thin rectangular blocks inside. She pursed her lips and wondered who could have sent it, and who delivered it. Recently, and not for the first time, a man from the Purina company had been snooping around, asking questions of them and their neighbors about their solvency and whether they'd be interested in selling off their land. It seemed that the vultures always circled when trouble was nearest, and even though they were in debt up to their eyeballs and desperately needed a break, Aileen knew that Oren would never abandon the farm. However, she also knew that if something good didn't happen for them soon, they would have no choice but to sell out like all the rest. The subject was never anything Oren wanted to talk about, but she had quietly begun to take notice of the wear such thoughts had begun to exert on him. It would all work itself out, God willing, she silently reassured herself, but deep in her heart, she wasn't so sure. She tucked all of the letters, with the exception of the heavy manila envelope, under her arm and began walking back toward a spot in the fence where she could more easily get back over. Stepping back over the drainage ditch, she ducked under the uppermost rail of the fence this time. Lord knows she didn't want to snag her dress again. After all, it was one of the few pretty ones she still owned. Once through, she stood up and headed back across the field toward the house, turning the thick brown package over in her hands. She again noticed its lack of postmark, and now saw that it had no return address. The only thing written on it was her name plainly printed in a simple, almost childlike script across the front. She smirked suspiciously. This is odd. She stepped over a clump of flowering weeds, and as she did so, a peal of thunder growled across the sky. She took another glance back at the horizon, back toward the cumulonimbus clouds that angrily loomed off in the distance. Definitely rain on its way. She returned her attention to the heavy envelope in her hands with a shrug of her shoulders. She was curious now, so she removed the rubber bands and wound them around her wrist out of habit. She then slid her thumbnail under the flap of the envelope and dragged it across. As she did, she continued to walk toward the house, the sound of her feet shishing through the tall grass being the only thing to be heard. A chill wind suddenly came up and pushed the envelope's flap open, almost as if an unseen hand had gently tried to help her to see what was inside. Aileen opened the envelope fully and peered into the yellow-hued interior. She stumbled to a halt, her mouth falling to an astonished gape. The letters, bills, and advertisements under her arm fluttered like autumn leaves to the dewy ground. She took a step backward. "Dear God," she said in a breathy hiss, her voice barely able to contain her astonishment and confusion. She looked around nervously, as if the envelope in her hands held one of her deepest, darkest secrets, and she feared someone coming up behind her and spying them over her shoulder. Inside the package, filed in neat regimental rows that were held together by two more of the thick rubber bands, were what appeared to be thin, banded stacks of currency, cash and lots of it. The entire envelope was packed with it. Forcing herself to calm down, she blinked her eyes and tried to focus on the uppermost bill on the first stack. Grover Cleveland's face grinned back at her like the Mona Lisa. Aileen excitedly looked toward the barn for Oren, but he was nowhere to be seen, still feeding the livestock, no doubt. She returned her gaze to the envelope in her hand and to President Cleveland's beautifully engraved face. Hesitantly, she slid her finger across the bills, pulling up the corner of one of the bundles. They were all $1,000 bills. There must have been at least 100 of them. Their total amount was more than she could count, much less imagine at a glance. Just to make sure she wasn't hallucinating, she once again slid her finger along the side of the stack, and the bills cascaded back into place. The flurry was like a flip book she'd seen at the library when she was young, single images rushing past, duplicating motion. As she stared at them, she was pretty sure that she saw President Cleveland wink at her. Behind the bundles, she found a single sheet of tri-folded bond paper. She could tell by looking at it that there was more of the same handwriting that had been scrawled on the front of the envelope on it. Almost afraid to do so, she pulled the paper free and anxiously unfurled it. The letter was held open by the wind as she read what was written there. "Mrs. Chaiken, please forgive the informality of this letter, but my current circumstances necessitate my contacting you in this covert manner rather than coming to see you directly. First of all, I want you to know that I am a friend of your father's. I wish there was a more personal way for me to tell you this, but unfortunately there is not. Monk was injured during a training exercise, and, as you know something of the nature of the work he was doing, an infection spread quickly through his system, resulting in his death. I humbly offer my condolences on your loss. I wanted you to also know that your father trained me when I was first recruited into the league, and I am proud to say we soon became good friends. He spoke often of you and of his desire to come to your farm to live out his years once he'd retired. When I saw him last, he was very excited about coming to visit with you, and spoke to me often of his great love for you and for your family. Please find enclosed a token that he wished to have passed along to you should something like this ever happen. Consider it an expression of his love for you and for your family. I know the two of you have had your differences, but it was his hope that you would be cared for. I hope that you will accept this small gesture and let it be of some comfort to you. Your father was a good man and taught me a great many things. It was my honor to have known him and to be the recipient of a bit of his vast and varied knowledge. He was my friend, and though I will never forget him, I will always miss him. Be well." Aileen looked up, directing her gaze toward the barn where Oren was still undoubtedly working and worrying for their future. As moisture spilled from her eyes, she quickly knelt down to gather up the mail she'd dropped. She stood, brushing the tears from her eyes, and then hurried off toward the barn to find her husband. Far off across the Chaikens' cornfields, under an old bent and gnarled walnut tree, a silhouette sat atop an all-black Suzuki GSX 1300R motorcycle, as if in meditation. The man and his machine were both hidden from the view of passers-by within the drapery of shadows. The rider idly watched the woman from a distance through a compact pair of binoculars as she hurried off toward the barn. Even from this far away, she looked like a nice lady, he thought, as he put the eyepiece away. Her features were a lot like Monk's, but softened by a dignified and natural beauty. Monk did good. With a flick of a switch, the bike's ignition caught, and the engine roared to growling life. The rider slid a pair of earbuds into his ears and pulled a full-face helmet over his head. He then zipped his jacket up, pulling a cell phone from his pocket. Looking down at the screen, he scrolled through the tracks on the phone's audio player until he found what he was looking for, a little something for the road. Hitting play, he tucked the phone back into his pocket. In the small earpieces, a piano began playing a soft counter-rhythm within the auditorium in his head. A plaintive voice cried out for a love long lost as a guitar wailed in mournful sympathy. The man took a quick glance down and patted the sword he'd secured to the side of the motorcycle, within easy reach, always now within easy reach. He looked back over toward where Monk's daughter and her husband were carving out their little slice of heaven, and a small, satisfied grin danced across his lips. Yeah, Monk did real good. Reaching out, he pulled in the clutch and kicked the bike into gear with a clunk. With a twist of his wrist, the motor growled, and the engine vibrated reassuringly beneath him. The guitar in his ear cried another plaintive note, and the voice whispered its sorrowful confession, and for a second all seemed right in the world. At least enough for him to call it a win. He settled into the seat and let the clutch out slowly. The motorcycle's back tire bit into the dirt, and the figure rode off into the distance, dark clouds reaching down from the heavens to embrace him.